I used to work loading racks at a supermarket. It wasn't too bad, but every now and then, you'd encounter some irritating customers. I enjoyed helping people, but it was frustrating when someone insisted we had something in stock when we didn't, or when a customer yelled at me because someone else dropped something. But the strangest customer I ever dealt with actually made me quit and left me a bit hesitant to interact with people altogether. It was an ordinary day, just like any other. My shift was pretty uneventful, especially in the last half, when it's almost time to go home, but I usually start zoning out. I was in the far corner of the store, which was usually quiet, stocking the shelves with soup that was on sale. Behind me was a small area, separated from the main grocery section, where we kept random items like kitchen supplies, pool toys, and seasonal decorations. That's when a well-groomed guy with a brown buzz cut approached me. He was tall, probably close to 7 feet, with a very square jaw. He looked somewhat serious, but also friendly, the kind of guy you might picture as a dad. There was something about him that made me think he could crack a joke at any moment, probably a pretty corny one. My initial impression of him turned out to be significant considering what happened later. I shook myself back to reality as I replied, "It's in aisle 15. He winked and gave me a thumbs up, saying, "Thanks, mate. You're a lifesaver." I smiled and returned to stocking the shelves, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye as he wandered toward aisle 15. A few moments later, after I finished putting a box on the shelf and moved to grab the next one, I noticed he was standing nearby, staring down at me with a puzzled expression. I guessed he felt a bit embarrassed when he grinned and asked, "Where's the ketchup?" I squinted at him. Did he forget the aisle? Was he struggling to find it, or maybe we were simply out? I doubted that. Either way, it didn't seem like a big deal. He probably just had something else on his mind. I directed him to aisle 15 again, and he winked back at me, giving me another thumbs up. "Thanks, mate. You're a real lifesaver," he said, then turned to wander down the aisle. I chuckled, and he paused, turning back to give me a slightly annoyed look. I shut my mouth, and he continued down the aisle, almost shuffling away. I hadn't meant to laugh at him. I thought he was just joking around. A moment later, I saw him walking toward the checkout with a girl who I assumed was his girlfriend. About 5 minutes later, after I finished stocking that end, I went to the back to restock some sparkling water. As I reached the other end of the aisle, I saw him standing there, looking lost. He turned his head and caught my eye, a look of recognition flashing across his face. He wasn't holding anything and didn't have a cart. "Didn't find the ketchup?" I asked him cheerfully. "Where's the ketchup, mate?" he replied, his smile unwavering. I couldn't help but let out a small laugh, scratching my head. He sounded exactly the same as before, almost like he was playing a recording instead of talking. I decided to show him directly where the ketchup was. "Are we out?" I asked. His smile faltered a bit. Maybe he really couldn't find it. "Here, I'll show you where it is." I started walking down the aisle, and sure enough, I could see the ketchup from where I was standing. He squinted at me, but he didn't move. This way," I gestured down the aisle. His eyes widened, as if I were speaking another language. After hesitating, he shuffled after me, his demeanor suddenly so different from before. He followed me timidly, like a lost child. When I stopped in front of the ketchup, he continued walking, unsure of why I had stopped. He looked at me expectantly, as if he was about to say something, but his lower lip trembled, and he shut his mouth again. Here, sir," I pointed at the ketchup bottles. He squinted a few times, staring at me like he was trying to solve a complex math equation in his head. He glanced over my body and focused on my pointing finger. It was an awkward situation. "The ketchup is right there," I stammered. Suddenly, his eyes lit up as if he had won the lottery. His pupils dilated, and then he grinned widely and nodded enthusiastically. "Thanks, mate. You're a lifesaver." He gave me the same thumbs up again. I laughed shyly. "Yeah, it happens to the best of us." "No problem." I walked back to my cart, glancing back to see him happily admiring the ketchup. I stacked some sparkling water onto my cart when Greg, the manager, called out to me. "Hey, John." Not my real name, but for reasons that will become clear, I prefer not to share my actual name. Greg popped out from behind a stack of pallets loaded with discounted toilet paper. He was short, so I hadn't noticed him at first. He laughed, though it sounded more like a choke. I swear he smokes at least 2 packs a day, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was 3. I started pulling the pallet toward the exit, and as I did, I noticed someone standing at the doors, likely waiting to come inside. But then they backed away. As I drew closer to the plastic window, I silently thanked them. It's hard to stop pulling a prank once you get going, so I pushed my way through the plastic doors. Just then, I heard someone snicker nearby. I thought it was Greg, but I didn't see him in front of me. The laugh didn't quite sound like his, it was somewhat different, almost mocking. I turned to find someone much taller than Greg standing there. It was the ketchup guy, grinning and giggling again, trying to mimic Greg's laugh. "Bring a bed out by broad stock," he said, roughening his voice to imitate Greg's. I was a bit confused but smiled sadly, thinking maybe he knew Greg or was just making fun of him. I chuckled and started to walk away, but he called out again, "Bring a bed out by broad stock." I mumbled something like, "Good one," and hurried off toward general stock, brushing off the encounter as a strange joke. I had work to do. It was already a long day. As I set up the bed, a young guy with a goatee and glasses approached me. "Excuse me, where's the washroom?" he asked, his accent distinctly British. I pointed it out, and he hurried off. I noticed he had a slight limp in his right leg as he disappeared around the corner, his footsteps echoing loudly as he dashed away. At that moment, another set of footsteps approached me from a nearby aisle, oddly similar to the first guy's. I'd never really paid attention to someone's walk before, but with his limp, it was unmistakable. I half expected him to pop back out from around the corner and ask me where the restroom was again, but it was the ketchup guy once more. "Excuse me, where's the washroom?" he asked, again in that same British accent, mocking the previous guy. I raised an eyebrow, realizing he was teasing. When I didn't laugh or respond right away, he looked around with a strange expression. At that moment, I thought he might be embarrassed. I attempted to be polite, saying, "I don't know what you're doing, but I'm just trying to do my job, okay?" His eyes widened as if he was on the verge of tears, which puzzled me. I pointed toward the restroom, and he nodded frantically before rushing off, still limping. Then I heard a shout from around the corner. "Good day, young man," an elderly woman called as she passed by. I waved back, still glancing toward the corner, when she asked, "Do you know where I can find the butter?" I moved closer and said, just down on aisle 17, right there." She thanked me and continued on her way. Suddenly, I felt a chill down my spine. 2 eyes were watching me from around the corner. My eyes widened as I saw someone's face peering out, filled with a fear that matched my own. Someone was lurking there, and as the old woman spoke, I noticed his lips moved in sync with her words. "Do you know where the cake mix is?" he asked, mimicking her voice. It wasn't just an impression anymore, it was eerily close to her actual voice. My jaw dropped as I realized it had to be a trick, but it was so uncanny that it felt almost impossible. He looked just as stunned as I was, his face displaying raw, unfiltered fear. I felt a shiver of confusion and unease course through my body. "Do you know where I can find the butter?" he repeated in the old woman's voice. It didn't sound like a joke at all now, it was as if he had truly taken on her voice. I was completely speechless. My mind raced, struggling to process why he was doing this. When I didn't respond, he faltered, stammering out more gibberish in the same impersonation. Suddenly, an announcement came over the intercom, "Attention to aisle 8 for a wet cleanup." The ketchup guy looked up, his mouth hanging open. He then repeated the announcement exactly as it had been played, his voice carrying the same mechanical quality you'd expect from a speaker. He grinned at me with wide eyes, and I instinctively shouted, "I don't know what the hell you're doing, but please leave me alone." He flinched at my outburst, raising his hands as if I were about to hit him. Tears streamed down his face, and he began to shake, wailing as though he were having a seizure. "Excuse me, where's the washroom?" he whimpered, again using the British accent of the first guy. I glanced around. No one else was nearby. I was at a loss for how to respond to such bizarre behavior. It felt so far removed from anything I had ever encountered that I just stood there stunned. He wailed again, "Hello." He cut himself off mid-sentence, his voice trailing into Greg's harsh laugh as he limped away, slouched over on his right leg. He raced into the general product area, ducking behind one of the racks. I wasn't sure what I would have done if I were still alone, but then I heard a rough voice next to me. "What's happening here?" It was Greg, actually him, not just someone mimicking his voice. I wasn't sure what to say, so I quickly blurted out a jumbled 10-second version of what had happened, still overwhelmed with confusion and terror. I pointed toward the rack where the guy had vanished, and there were his two brown eyes watching us. Goosebumps prickled over my skin, and I felt a terrible knot in my stomach. Everything about this situation felt wrong. Greg started to murmur, "What the hell?" The person behind the rack echoed him. Greg approached, and the guy seemed like he wanted to escape, but as Greg questioned him, he mouthed the words back. The man stepped out from around the corner, crouching down to Greg's level. "What are you doing?" he asked, tilting his head at Greg as he repeated the question, backing away like a cornered rabbit. Greg's eyes narrowed as I followed closely behind him, a sinking feeling telling me something awful was about to happen, and I was right. In the general product area, a loud air conditioning unit hummed in the corner. Greg had the guy backed right up to it. Normally calm, Greg wasn't having it this time. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what you're doing, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man began to cry, mimicking Greg's laugh. "What the?" Greg said, confused. Then, as the guy brushed against the air conditioning unit, his eyes widened so much I thought they might pop out of his head. He froze as if he'd been electrocuted, and suddenly let out a scream filled with a multitude of voices and tones, like a crowd was trapped in his throat, echoing throughout the entire building. Greg stumbled back while I stood frozen in place. The man fell to his knees, covering his face with his hands as he wailed, still repeating the same phrases he had echoed to me. "Where's the ketchup, mate?" "Great day, young man. Bring a bed out by Broadstock." Greg's laughter mixed with the man's cries. "Thanks, mate. You're a lifeline." The man slowly uncovered one of his hands from his face, trembling, and formed a thumbs up. Then he laughed, echoing Greg's chuckle, before scratching at his throat with his other hand while still holding the thumbs up. Suddenly, he collapsed face first onto the floor, curling up in a fetal position. By then, a few people had come over to see what was going on, gasping in shock, but I didn't take my eyes off the scene. He continued to repeat the same phrases over and over, sometimes mixing up the voices while still crying. Greg told me he was going to get security. I mumbled something vague and kept watching. I had a strange thought as I looked at him. He resembled an embryo, detached from the womb too soon. Then the man went still, staring blankly at the ceiling with an empty expression, murmuring in sync with the loud air conditioning unit. It didn't sound like a person trying to mimic a mechanical noise, it was more like an echo. His whole face and neck jerked as if something inside him was trying to escape. This went on for about 30 seconds before he looked at me, pure despair in his eyes. "Please," he said, using my voice, exactly my voice. I gasped, and my confusion seemed to push him over the edge. He jumped up, hunched over, and limped past me as fast as he could, rushing toward the exit. I watched him go, wondering if I should have done something, but I was too stunned to act. Even if I could have moved, what could I have done? Greg returned with the security guard. I didn't tell them the whole story, just that the guy had run off, and they laughed it off. Greg let me take some time off after that, and I didn't say anything to anyone the rest of the day. That evening, I quit my job and haven't gone back to that supermarket since. I try to avoid strangers as much as possible. Whenever someone opens their mouth, I half expect them to start acting like that man. I don't know what happened to him or what he was, if he was even human. I just don't know.